Hi, I'm Derek Ashong, and you are now in the stream. Today, the future of Tibet. We'll look into the debate over the nation's sovereignty and how their new prime minister in exile could change relations with China. Our digital producer, Ahmed Shahab-Eldin, is here looking out for your live feedback as always. And with us again on the couch for a second day is Azita Ardakani, Chief Idea Officer and founder of the social media agency Love Social. Azita, tell us about your latest project.
We're really excited about this, Derek. We're actually working on a youth-based project that is taking and connecting with youth in university and colleges across North America to help them understand both professionally and academically, as well as personally, how to really utilize social towards things that they believe in.
Now, one of the things you've mentioned is that because social is so new, people use it differently. How is it that college students, for example, use it differently than you or I?
I think the big thing to remember is because it's 5 to 6 years old on a whole, someone 5 to 6 years younger than us has a totally different relationship with it and has kind of grown with it in a different way than you and I have. So we really want to help youth understand and help them carve the future of social media in their own hands.
Well, speaking of the future of social media, we're actually really lucky that today we're going to be having, joining us in our main discussion, some of our viewers from Google+, and they're actually joining us in a hangout right now, and so it's great to have you all on. We look forward to talking with you in greater detail in just a few. We'll be getting to some of their questions any minute now. Also, remember, you can tell us what stories matter to you. Follow us on Twitter and send a tweet to us using the hashtag AJStream. We might feature your suggestions in a future episode.
So this next story is one that many in our online community have been telling us to revisit. The proposed site of a $90 million naval base on South Korea's largest tourist destination, Jeju Island, has heightened tensions between residents and the government. Many activists see the naval base as an effort to help the U.S. contain China's growing military power. And recently, in Gangjung village, a face-off between citizens, riot police, and the Korean Navy has been escalating for the last 5 years. Hundreds of riot police have assembled around the village in response to protests. Now, using the online curation tool Storify, which we use here on the show, Aim High 2400 has documented events on the ground on Wednesday in the village. And as you can see right here from the first photo, villagers have created makeshift masks to protect themselves against the threat of tear gas and water cannons. Now, we have other photos that are included here. As you can see, where the Korean military entered Gangjung village, they were met with these villagers who were mainly made up of women who blocked the road leading into the town. Now, it's interesting to note that the caption right here in the top left says, "Jeju is women's island." Now, Jeju Island is known in South Korea for the strong role that women play in their community. And that typically, they make a living by themselves using agriculture and fishing, while many men have stay-at-home roles. Now, at the bottom of this Storify, we're just going to scroll right down, there's this video that shows what happened when the riot police returned and tried to come into the village. So we're just going to play a little shot of this. It seems that we're having some trouble loading this, but essentially it's a video that shows more of the women actually preventing the riot police from coming in. We'll tweet that out to make sure that you can watch it. There you go. You see the woman in the yellow just preventing the riot police. I'm going to zoom in there. You can see her arguing with those who are actually not riot police. That's the Navy dressed in camouflage. Now, opposition parties have called for the National Assembly to reconsider its approval of the Jeju base, but the government is pressing ahead with plans to finish the base by 2014. Hundreds of military veterans have also arrived in Jeju to form a counter-protest and are labeling the peace activists that you see right here as North Korean sympathizers. Now, you could follow this story using the hashtag #SaveJejuIsland, but here in the meantime are some of the hashtags that you have suggested for us to follow.
On Monday, 29-year-old Sewang Norbu, a monk in the Tibetan area of Sichuan province, set himself on fire to protest China's policies on Tibet. According to the advocacy group Free Tibet, before immolating himself, Norbu called for Tibetan freedom and the return of the Dalai Lama to his homeland. If you take a look at this video, which I'm about to show you, Tibetans around the world have actually been holding vigils to commemorate the death of this young monk. Let's take a look at this one in particular. Now, what would drive a man to such extreme measures? Activists say that since the 2008 riots in Tibet, Chinese authorities have increased their restrictions on freedom to practice their religion, speak their native language, and phone and internet services are constantly being monitored and shut down. Another significant development for the Tibetan community was the swearing in of the exile community's first democratically elected prime minister, Lobsang Sangay. Here's a quick video that shows you some footage of his actual oath-taking ceremony. A Harvard Law academic, Lobsang Sangay serves as the diaspora's first secular leader on political matters. People are now wondering if there's a new hope for improved conditions for the Tibetan people. Could this move to secular politics lead Tibetans to a more constructive dialogue with China? Joining us now via Skype to discuss this, from Dharamsala, we have Darden Sharling of the Tibetan Women's Association. She's also a new member of the Tibetan Parliament in Exile, which aligns itself with the Dalai Lama's middle way policy of autonomy under the Chinese government. Also joining us from New York is Tendor Dorji, Executive Director of Students for a Free Tibet, a worldwide network of youth working to promote Tibetan independence through education and nonviolent action. Tendor and Darden, welcome to you both. Darden, let me begin with you. What change do you believe this new prime minister will bring to Chinese relations or Tibetan relations with China?
The new Prime Minister, Dr. Lobsang Sangay, who got sworn in just a week ago, is Tibet's first secular leader. And what is very awe-inspiring in this case is he's a young
Darden, I believe we're losing your audio and your video seems frozen, so we're going to come back to you in just a quick second. Let's move on. Tell me now, what we want to think a little bit about what's going on from the perspective of Tibetans in exile and what might be the difference between their perspective and that of those in Tibet. So Tendor, is there a diversion or a division between the interests of those Tibetans who are like yourself and like the new prime minister in exile and those who are actually living in Tibet?
I think it's very clear that the Tibetan exile community is the most free and the most the ultimate representative body and the spokesperson of the Tibetans living in Tibet, because the Tibetans in Tibet, the 6 million Tibetans living in Tibet, live under constant repression of the Chinese government, and they are not allowed. They don't even have freedom of speech. They don't have freedom of even freedom of silence. You know, Tibetans go to jail constantly for not only speaking out what they believe in, but for not saying things, for remaining silent, and for refusing to show loyalty to the Chinese government, for refusing to express their loyalty to the Chinese government. So I think the Tibetans living in exile, 150,000 plus Tibetans, with our established Tibetan government in exile, with our elected representatives in the parliament, and the Tibetan movement, the group of Tibetan support groups. This is truly the representative and the voice that can really speak for the Tibetan people. So I think, you know, there's a lot of traffic also in communication between Tibetans living in Tibet and in exile, and a lot of Tibetans in exile constantly keep in touch with their families, friends back home in Tibet through the internet, through phones. So I think it's really, there's no difference. Your point is well taken, Tendor.
Let's get Darden back in, because I think that we've got her connection back on. Darden, we were making a point about what you think is the import of this new prime minister.
Yes, the new Prime Minister, Dr. Lobsang Sangay, who got sworn in a week ago, is historically Tibet's first secular leader. And what is awe-inspiring about him is he's someone who had to lead his entire life in exile because his parents were forced to flee the illegal Chinese occupation of Tibet. So what we see now is the unquenched thirst of the Tibetan people living in exile diaspora to go back to their homeland, to return to the homeland. And also you see cases of Tibetans actually risking their lives, calling for the return of the Dalai Lama and for the unification of the motherland. So this is something that the Prime Minister, the newly sworn in Prime Minister, pledges to do. He is committed to making the return of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to Tibet possible, and to seeing that the Tibetans in exile and Tibetans in Tibet are reunited. And this is something that all of us, all the Tibetans, Tibetans belonging to all different generations are looking forward to. And this is something we're hoping to achieve in the next 5 years.
Well, it's certainly something that's drawing a lot of global attention, and we're getting a lot of comments and questions from our online audience. But Azita, I know you had some for our guests as well.
Yeah, I was just wondering, I've heard that Lobsang, because he's been raised in exile, his ability to communicate in Chinese is not very good. Is that going to be kind of a fundamental step in the middle way policy? Doesn't he need to be able to communicate with the Chinese government?
Is that for Darun?
Either or.
Go ahead,
doesn't
Sandra.
matter.
You can answer that.
Yeah, I think, if I may, I think Tibetans have a distinct language and a distinct culture and our own distinct nationhood. And Tibetans speak Tibetan. They don't speak Chinese. We don't speak Chinese. Right. We may learn Chinese. We may choose to learn Chinese in universities. And I understand that Lobsang has also learned Chinese, spent a little time learning Chinese so that he may better be able to communicate with the Chinese government. But I think in general, every time there is negotiation, when possible, and communicating between cultures, I think it is not necessary for a Tibetan leader and for a Tibetan representative to know Chinese in order to communicate with the Chinese people, because there are many Tibetans living in Tibet whose Chinese is excellent, but the Chinese government, if they do not want to listen to Tibetan voices, it doesn't matter what language we use.
Tender, on that question, we have Sarah Mughal, who's on Twitter asking, what is the self-immolation achieved in Tibet? Did it help in Tibetan struggle for freedom? And a lot of people are seeing this as an act of violence rather than an act of non-violence. So do you think it's effective? Maybe answer her question.
Absolutely. And I think, just to be clear, self-immolation, this act of lighting oneself on fire in order to express a political view, in order to make a sacrifice for a larger ideal, is not something that has happened only in Tibetan tradition or Tibetan resistance. It is something that has been happening since the 1960s. Ever since 1963, the first Vietnamese monks began to light themselves up in protest against their regime at that time.
But to that point, Tandor, this is something that hasn't been actually happening in Tibetan Buddhism. So yes. Does this signify something new?
Yes, absolutely. In the Tibetan resistance, this is definitely a new phenomenon that we are beginning to see. And since 2009, we have seen 3 incidents of self-immolation by Tibetans. And this really shows the nature, the degree to which the Chinese repression in Tibet has progressed to, and how unbearable it has become for Tibetans to live under the Chinese government. But at the same time, I refuse to believe that this incident may consist of violence, because violence constitutes of harming others. In this instance, these Tibetans are offering themselves, their own bodies, to the cause of their nation. And whether you look at the case of the Tunisian self-immolation by Mohamed Bouaziz, I think it really helps to light a fire in the minds of their entire nation. And it had an impact in Tunisia in the uprising that eventually went on to become successful. And I think the Tibetan self-immolation cases will have a similar impact, although it is a tragic incident and something that nobody wants to encourage, but we cannot deny the fact that this is an ultimate act of compassion and love and nonviolence.
Tandor, so we've got a lot of questions coming in from our online community, and we want to send the first one to Darden. So Ahmed, what have you got from Google+?
Yeah, on Google+, we have Jay Burke in Kuwait. And Jay Burke, why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, what is the, in terms of the middle way, what's His Holiness the Dalai Lama's position? Autonomy from China or independence for the Chinese nation?
Okay, so Darden, to you.
Right. Thanks, G. Burke, for the question. The middle way policy is something that the Tibetan government in exile adopted way back in 1996 and 1997. The middle way policy is a means to resolving the long-standing issue between Tibet and China. So it is a policy, or rather, if you call it a strategy, it is, in casual terms, it's a way out. So it is in an attempt to resolve the problems existing in Tibet, and in a bid to also negotiate and to compromise with the Chinese leadership. The Tibetan government based here in exile, Dharamsala, opted for this policy. But having said that, the middle way policy is not an end in itself. It is a way, it is a means to an end, and it is not here to stay forever.
Darden, why is independence not an option?
Well, independence was always an option, right from the time of the 13th Dalai Lama, when the Tibetan independence was getting tampered and when it was threatened by the Chinese forces. Way back then, Tibetans were very much struggling. They've given up lives for the cause of Tibet's independence, and it always remains an option. It remains the aspiration of the 6 million Tibetans inside and outside Tibet. But as I said, the middle way approach is a solution to the problem. There is a problem. The problem is it's just gaining its momentum. It's just increasing in terms of its scope and in terms of the kind of effect that it's having on the lives of the Tibetans inside Tibet. And at such a dire scenario and the circumstances like this, it is very prompt and it's timely, and it's also obligatory for the government in exile to come up with a solution, a practical solution. And middle way policy fits in here.
Let me get Tendor in on this. Tendor, is it possible for the government in exile to have any impact whatsoever on the ground in Tibet?
I think the government in exile is an institution or an entity that the Tibetans living in Tibet really look to as their legitimate and ultimate representative. So I think on a regular basis, the Tibetan government in exile has an impact on the ground inside Tibet, because the Tibetan people listen to the Tibetan government. They look at what they're saying. They want to listen to what the Tibetan government is saying. So I think the impact is absolutely there, as much as the Tibetans inside Tibet continue to impact the Tibetan government in exile as well. But I also want to address what Darren just said about the middle way approach of the Tibetan government in exile, because as Darren said, independence is always an option for the Tibetan people. And for us, for many of us, including students of Free Tibet, and many young Tibetans, I think independence is our fundamental right. And there is no Tibetan who would argue against that. We have a fundamental right to Tibetan independence because Tibet existed as a historically independent nation in the past, even at a time when China was not an independent country. And today, we believe actually that independence is achievable and is possible. And the middle way approach is an approach and a temporary solution that the Tibetan government is pursuing. But at the same time, I personally believe that the Chinese government, the way it is behaving right now and the way it is set up, is not capable of delivering autonomy to the Tibetan people, because autonomy is achievable and possible only with the consent.
Tendor, we've got a lot of thoughts on this, and we want to give you a chance to express some additional thoughts, but let's get our online community involved.
Yeah, it seems sure. Pirate_Larry on Twitter is agreeing with you. He says, independence. China's military dictators think cultural hegemony is the same thing as autonomy. But then you were just criticizing the Chinese government, and maybe you can make some recommendations. We have DJ Adderdom asking, what can the new prime minister do to turn the futile meetings with the Chinese government of the past into meaningful discussions? Tender?
I think there is a lot that this new Tibetan administration can do. First of all, the election is an historic achievement for the Tibetan people. This is the first time we have had a secular leadership for Tibet. And I think the new Prime Minister, Lobsang Sangye, what he can do is make sure that until now, religion has had a huge influence on Tibetan politics, and including the middle way approach, that even is a policy that is rooted in religion, that is rooted in Buddhism, Buddhist philosophy's middle way approach. And one of the first things that the new leadership can do is making sure that Tibetan politics and our foreign policy and our local politics and the approach to the world our worldview is something that is defined by real politics instead of religion and spirituality and Dharma.
We've got another question that's coming in, actually. This is coming in for Darden on Facebook.
Darden, we're seeing a question from Tibet Truth asking why your organization is so silent currently on the issue of Tibetan women forcibly sterilized by China.
Let me correct the person who asked this question, because the Tibetan Women's Association, since mid 80s, since the time we were reinstated in exile, a chunk of our work, was on voicing out against the systematic violence against Tibetan women, and especially the Chinese family planning policy that curbs the Tibetan population. So we have done good amount of work on that to an extent where this issue has, come to the international attention. And especially in 1995, when the World Conference on Women was being held in Beijing, our delegates, 9 Tibetan women actually represented Tibetan women in Tibet, and, just voiced out and advocated this very case on the international platform, thus drawing much attention and much support to this. So we haven't been silent. In fact, it has been always at the heart of the matter.
Okay, Ahmed, I think we have more from Google+.
Yeah, we have one question from Kareem on Google+. So Kareem, go ahead and please ask your question.
Hi. Well, my question is basically, what assurance do the Tibetan youth who are crossing over into India across the Himalayas have of actually being accepted into India, seeing that most of them have to travel a very treacherous journey and sometimes even get turned back?
Let's take that to Tendor.
I think I understood that as what do the Chinese government do to Tibetans and children who are trying to cross over the Himalayas into Nepal and India?
Yes.
And these are Tibetans who are escaping from Tibet to Nepal and India, where they find some degree of freedom in exile. And the Chinese government and the authorities and the Border Patrol, for many years, they have been trying to restrict the border so that Tibetans find it harder to escape. But even then, over 3,000 Tibetans routinely every year find a way out over the Himalayas on foot until 2008, when the restrictions at the border became much tighter. And actually, in 2006, in September, there was one incident where Chinese Border Patrol was shooting at a group of Tibetan refugees, unarmed Tibetan refugees, with their back facing the soldiers. They were running away into Nepal, and these Border Patrol shot at those escaping Tibetans and killed Kesang Namso, 17-year-old nun, on that day. And this was captured on camera. And there were plenty of other incidents that are never captured on camera. So Tibetans have a really hard time escaping into freedom from Tibet.
Tender, let me ask you a question, because I know I actually have some footage on my screen now of a debate for Tibet, or at least a protest advocating Tibetan independence in Washington, D.C. earlier this year. Is it not too easy or simplistic for Tibetans living in exile to be calling for independence? How realistic is it, given the current relationship between Tibet and China, for independence to be achieved?
And Derek, I'm going to add to that. Also, in base of communication, like you mentioned, they're so disconnected. How are they supposed to look outwards to their leaders in exile, take the communication, and disseminate it amongst themselves?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. I think Tibetans inside Tibet routinely have called for independence. And in fact, it is the Tibetan government that is calling for autonomy. And on a regular basis, from individual to individual, Tibetans always express their desire for independence, because that is what they believe is their fundamental right. And I think in the debate, independence is, people think that independence seems unrealistic. But I believe that autonomy is more unrealistic than independence for many reasons, including one key reason that the Chinese government is not the Canadian government, it's not the British government. And people look at Quebec and Scotland and think that, wow, autonomy for Tibet would be great if Tibet can be like Quebec and Scotland. But that is something that is not possible, because if you look at the British government and the Canadian government, these are democratic governments with democratic systems and institutions and rule of law that respect human rights and individual. But the Chinese government, these values are unknown to the Chinese government, and this current regime...
Tendor, I'm going to have to close the conversation at that point. I think we've run out of time, but I want to thank both you, Darden and Tendor, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Appreciate it. And thank
Thank
you,
you.
Azita and Ahmed, as well. We're going to be discussing on Monday a new report on crime and violence that's threatening stability in Venezuela. Please send us any information that you have, videos, tweets, etc. Send them to AJ Stream. Hopefully we can put them into the show. Now we're going to our post show at stream.aljazeera.com, where we're going to be discussing issues happening currently in Mexico, as well as a big story out of Hershey. We'll see you there. Hi, welcome to the Post Show. We've just had an amazing conversation about some ongoing events in Tibet. We want to now switch to some different territories, things happening in a couple of other parts of the world. Let's actually start this next one in Mexico. And we've been hearing reports about two hashtags that are quite interesting. They're going along with the prefix balacera. One is balacera vez, which I guess is dealing with things happening in Veracruz. The other is Balacera MTY, dealing with Monterrey. Now, I know that we have one of our guests on Google Plus who is a young Mexican. She's working with us here at AJ Stream. Liz, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Okay, tell us a little bit about what you saw when you were looking at those two Twitter accounts. What are people using those for with regard to narco traffic?
So basically, those Twitter accounts act as like community policing, and they crowdsource information, you know, what's going on.
Liz, I think we've actually lost your audio for just a second there. Can you say something one more time?
I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Okay, so basically, they crowdsource information, you know, what's happening in what part of town, so people won't go there and people won't be caught in the crossfire. So yeah, it's really interesting. I think it, I guess, makes you wonder like how, if government is obsolete, or at least the policemen, like, are they even relevant anymore if people are taking care of each other through social media?
This is the thing that we want to discuss. Thank you for that, Liz. And Ahmed has got some examples on his website, or actually on his screen, about tweets coming from this site. And basically, people are saying, you know, you've got to be careful when you're walking. Well, I can't read it now that we switched to the next one. But they're saying, you know, if you're walking by yourself, be careful of possible dangers. And what seems to be happening, Azita, is that folks are taking the role that public safety officials previously would have, and now they're using social media to actually give each other ongoing information about the violence from narco traffic.
I mean, what I think is most interesting is we've seen this happen with
Numerous times.
with public safety, with public health, certain initiatives using social media, but with public safety, where it's actually, you know, spotting dangers, is it a better tool than your own government? Maybe it is.
Well, it's interesting because usually it's the public, you know, officials that are doing this for the community. In this case, the community is acting as the public officials to kind of ping everyone on the ground and let them know what to do and what not to do. The thing in these situations that you have to watch for, though, is, you know, it might have a following of 30,000 plus followers, but that doesn't necessarily dictate that those are the community members of that specific area. So it can sometimes be misleading in that form as well.
So part of the reason we're covering this is because we got these tweets, and this one says, Twitter account set up to alert people in certain Mexican cities about shootings going on in real time. Then we see another one, check out these two, they report what is going on in those cities related to the narco war. And then finally, the truth is, this is the only way we know what is going on because most shootings aren't reported in the news.
Yeah.
And speaking of shootings, you know, this is one of the videos that they tweeted out from their accounts. We're just going to play it. It's hard to really tell what's happening, but it's already garnered about 37,000 views. And what it is it's at a birthday party. A 5-year-old girl was apparently shot. So it's documenting that violence. And I think Liz on Google Plus wants to qualify this a little bit for us. So Liz, are you with us?
Yeah, I'm here. So I just want to say how a lot of these accounts do have a lot of followers, and you know, you wonder how many of those followers are actually tweeting out truthful events that are happening in, you know, the town or wherever they're tweeting, because they can be misleading as well. And I think it's something, you know, take note of, that maybe some of the reports are false and they're trying to mislead people so the police won't go there, or so maybe it's like the bad people who are trying to mislead others.
Well,
you know,
this is
I think
part of
that's
the
just
interesting
something
thing.
that we don't really think about sometimes.
Liz, this is one of the most interesting things, because we saw a similar question coming up when we were looking at coverage of Syria, where you don't have a lot of journalists on the ground. We've seen a large number of journalists actually be murdered in Mexico, and we've covered this story a couple of times this year, actually more than a couple of times. If you go to our website, stream.aljazeera.com, you can search for some of our stories on what's happening in Mexico. But one of the critical points there is, if you have a situation where you don't have journalists on the ground, where in some instances you don't even have police on the ground, and social media becomes our window into those communities, how do you deal with these issues of verification? On the one hand, we can say, well, we don't know if it's true. On the other hand, we're not hearing much else.
If you get enough public coverage and there's enough public outcry, I feel like that's when it shifts from individual governance over to public awareness, which officially goes into politicians ideally speaking about these issues. It has to kind of go from somewhere. But I think the breeding ground is through social media initially. I mean, these issues have to come to light one way or another.
So there's another issue that I want to flip to that is been really blossoming on social media and is starting to get some significant mainstream media attention. And that is this issue in Hershey, Pennsylvania, of these young people who are alleging to have been put under, come to work under very, very difficult circumstances. If you're not already familiar with this, you can actually go onto Twitter or TweetDeck or whatever right now and do a search for the hashtag Hershey, H-E-R-S-H-E-Y. And in a nutshell, these young people have come to the country under the guise of a work and travel visa. They work for 2 months, then they have an opportunity to travel during the summer. However, students walked out of a Hershey, Pennsylvania factory. 200 students walked out actually in the recent weeks because they said that they were working under inhumane conditions. Azita, talk to us a little bit about this. This is something that you brought to our attention. What do you think is at the root of this
I just thought it was incredible because, here's a conglomerate that's super well known, bringing in under the guise of, a student workplace. The students actually come from anywhere from China to Argentina. They pay $3,000 to $6,000 to be here for the summer. And according to some reports, they're getting somewhere from $40 to $140 for their entire time. And they're working in terrible circumstances. Hershey's officials, however, say that they're not responsible for this one way or another. We thought this was really interesting because, again, it's a great kind of symptom of a conglomerate that's totally disconnected with its retailers or distribution model and not taking ownership from the front to end kind of portion of their business.
Yeah, so this is the interesting thing when they're talking about, it has here a great example. Hershey saying that they outsourced actually getting the workers for this process, or at least the process of getting these student workers. The plant is saying that it's actually separate from Hershey and that they used a different company that actually did the employment staffing. So everyone seems to be passing the buck. But then let's look at the stuff that the kids are actually saying, and they're raising some really interesting points. Here is a comment from a young woman from Turkey. She said, you stand, this is talking about her 8-hour shift, begins at 11 p.m. She says, you stand for the entire 8 hours. It's the worst thing for your fingers and hands and your back. You're standing at an angle. Then we have another person, a student from Nigeria, who says, since I came here, I have a permanent ache in my back. Holding a pen is now a big task for me. My muscles ache. I mean, is it possible that these kids are being subject in the United States to the kind of working conditions that Americans typically deplore in other parts of the world?
Yeah, and I think we've been seeing this happen with several companies in the corporate sector. I mean, we even talked about the Zara incident, which is similar, which we spoke about yesterday.
The Spanish company in Brazil, we talked about it yesterday.
Right, in Brazil. And then also it happens in government and media. I mean, you could even make correlations to Rupert Murdoch and his empire, his media empire, and that idea of top-down management and using the guise of, we weren't aware of the problem or we weren't aware of this happening. Obviously, it's lucrative economically, so perhaps they are aware. But we have comments or questions about this on Google+.
All right.
Maybe we'll go to Jai Ho first. So go ahead, Jai Ho, ask us your question.
Sorry, I'm Kareem.
Kareem, my mistake. We got confused.
No
Kareem,
problem.
Go ahead, Kareem.
My question was, how many companies do you think get away with the term interning as a form of free labor, especially with young universities in the summer?
I think lots of companies get away with free labor in the form of interns. I'll tell you what, honestly, in my experience, I used to live in Los Angeles.
Right.
When I first got to LA as like a young man, I lived there for a couple of times, and I was just out of college, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed. I used to work every day, 5 days a week for like 8 to 10 hours. And I got a stipend to enable me to buy gas to get back to the office every day.
Right.
And that was my quote unquote internship. So I think that this is a real issue. I think what's also interesting in this particular case, Kareem, is that we have a situation where, you know, or at least what strikes me is the United States calls itself a paragon of human rights. And we deplore human rights conditions in lots of different parts of the world. Now you have students from other countries coming here and being treated the way that workers are treated in some of these countries that we say we quote unquote deplore. I mean, I think it's a public embarrassment.
I know someone else at Google Plus had a question, but I'm not sure, I don't want to mess it up. But I did want to point out one thing that I thought was really interesting is it's this idea of companies getting really productive workers for free. Because those workers, when they're foreign and when they're already living through compromised situations, even if it's domestic workers coming from, you know, parts of South Asia to certain parts of the Middle East, that's a common phenomenon. They're usually, you know, hard workers, and if you're going to get harder workers for free, it's arguable. It's tough to argue with the economic incentive there. I mean,
I just think that it's funny that every time something like this happens in the States, it's so outlandish as soon as it hits media, kind of. But the organization, the Council for Education Travel USA, brings in lots of student workers for lots of companies year after year. And the situation that these students were in here are probably not a fraction of how terrible it is abroad and at a, you know, definitely higher exponential rate of students working.
I think that's a great point. I mean, even the pain that these kids are going through is a fraction of what other people are seeing. Another interesting quote that came from this young woman, Turkish woman working there. She said when she was offered a contract for a job at a plant with Hershey's chocolates, she said she was excited. We've all seen Charlie's Chocolate Factory, she said. We thought this is good. Sometimes all is not as sweet as it seems. It's definitely been sweet though talking to all our people on Google+. Thanks you guys for joining us. Thank you Azita for being here once again.
For having me.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Ahmed, as always.
Thanks for having us.
Done a great job. Thank you for being with us. Remember, you can continue conversing with us online using the hashtag AJStream. We will see you on the web.